I wanted to do a video about our menstrual cycle and how it actually affects our training. It seems a really common topic at the minute, but a lot of females seem to think, oh, I'm weaker on my period because that's what everyone says, so I'm going to adjust my training and either not train at the first few days of my period or keep it real light. But I wanted to actually give a bit of information about how it affects us and that everyone is different and the effects that it actually has will vary quite a bit from person to person. So the main hormones that we have that tend to change throughout our menstrual cycle that can affect us are estrogen, progesterone and testosterone. But a lot of the studies are pretty consistent in the sense that our testosterone doesn't vary that widely. So the actual drop and increase in testosterone throughout our cycle doesn't have any impact whatsoever on our strength changes. So the main hormones we're going to talk about are estrogen and progesterone. So the first day of your menstrual cycle is your bleed, your period. At this time, this tends to last 3 to 7 days. It varies from person to person, but at this time your estrogen and progesterone plummet. So this is when you tend to feel your worst, you're quite moody, you feel lethargic, you're not really in the mood for doing very much. So this is the time that most people do feel like their training is affected, but we will go into this in a little bit more detail later on. The next stage is our follicular phase, which tends to last between 13 and 21 days. Again, varies from person to person. This does actually overlap with your period, your bleed. So the first part of it, the hormones are quite low, your estrogen and progesterone, but then once your bleed ends, your testosterone and your estrogen start to increase. So at this stage, you tend to feel a lot better, your mood's increasing, your libido's higher. This is where you actually tend to feel your best throughout your menstrual cycle. This then leads to your ovulation, which only tends to last 1 to 2 days when you get your LH peak. During this time, this is where your testosterone and estrogen are at the absolute highest for these 2 days. You're feeling your best, you're the most confident, you've got the highest sex drive. So this is when everyone says you should peak your training, do your heaviest sessions. But again, we'll go more detail about the changes around that once I've gone over the different parts of our cycle. Then we go into our luteal phase, which tends to last 10 to 17 days. Your estrogen starts to drop, your testosterone starts to drop, but your progesterone increases. So this is when we do tend to feel a bit shittier. Your sex drive tends to decrease. You can tend to get more hunger pangs. You tend to get some premenstrual symptoms like low mood, feelings of depression sometimes, cramps. This is a pre-period sort of phase where people tend to get the worst symptoms and tend to feel quite bad, which then starts your cycle again, leading on to your period. So, in theory, you are stronger in your follicular phase than you are in your luteal phase. However, the changes are actually very, very minimal, and most people do not actually notice the difference with their strength changes. The mood changes tend to have a bigger effect on how their strength actually feels. So with a lot of studies, your anaerobic, aerobic and strength changes throughout your cycle do not actually vary very much at all. There is a very minimal change on a few studies which show that you are stronger in your follicular phase, however, you're actually more explosive in your luteal phase. And certain muscle groups tend to be affected by the changes in estrogen, whereas others don't. So some of your more dominant muscles aren't actually affected, whereas the ones which aren't can be affected. So for example, like your hamstrings could be a little bit weaker at a certain stage in your period, but that, in a lot of studies, that does not actually affect your overall strength outcome in terms of maxes and so on. Estrogen has a neuroexcitatory effect, which I can never say properly. So that is why you tend to be at your strongest when it's at its highest, whereas progesterone has the opposite. So you're technically strongest or feeling your best when estrogen is its highest and progesterone is at its lowest, which is the follicular phase, which is why we're supposed to be stronger in this phase. But a lot of studies have looked into your perceived effect of it, so how you actually feel or how you think it's going to affect you, which in pretty much every study has shown that the people who believe that they are more affected at certain stages in their period actually are, whereas those who kind of don't really look into it as much and just train the way they're supposed to train, the progression that their coach has given them, do have a more positive effect and less strength fluctuations throughout their cycle. But as anyone who's a strength athlete or a competitive athlete knows that, like, what is in our head is the biggest effect to our training. Something that you mentally believe is going to, if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't believe you can do a certain lift, if you don't believe you're strong enough for something, chances are you're not going to do it, because the way you feel and the way you think going into something is going to have a far bigger effect than the slightest hormonal change. If your strength is down, I don't know, 0.2%, you actually believing in yourself is going to have a bigger effect than that 0.2% drop. So to sum it up a little bit more, the actual menstrual symptoms, like your low mood, will have a bigger effect on your training than the actual change in hormones. So if you do want to change your training around your cycle because of how you feel, that is totally fine. Personally, I don't tend to change anything just because there are far bigger things that actually affect your training than where you are in your menstrual cycle. So for example, your sleep. Let's say you plan to do a really big lift after your period when you're at your strongest, but you get a really shitty night's sleep that night, or you're really stressed because of work. These things are actually going to have a far bigger effect than those change in hormones and even the small change in mood. Because if your sleep's low, your mood's going to drop, even if you're supposed to be at your happiest time. A lot of coaches will give you programs based on, you might get a slight range or an RPE or something like that. So if you are feeling a bit shitty, regardless of if it's your period or if you've just not slept well, work's been stressful, you can't be asked training, just go to the lower end of that. Or if it's based on RPE, then obviously RPE is RPE, you're not always going to be hitting top numbers with it. But you're given a range, just go to the lower end of that range. I tend to just build up to whatever numbers I've got set, and if I'm maybe 10-15% off it and I'm feeling like utter shite, I'll just do my work on those numbers. Like, it all counts, it's all the same stimulus, you're not always going to be at your best, but again, it doesn't always coincide with where your cycle is actually at. Personally, I don't like the idea of training around your cycle, just because I've hit some huge PBs when I'm at my weakest and feeling my shittest, but it all comes down to the peak of your cycle. Your training cycle, not your menstrual cycle. But also, let's say you do plan everything around your menstrual cycle and then it comes to comp day and you're on your period. So you're massively in your head now that your strength is affected because of your period. You believe that, oh yeah, your training's always been around it, so now it's come to comp and you're at your absolute weakest. But again, you're not really going to be, it is going to be in your head. Like, you can do what you can do on comp day, the adrenaline will get you through, even if you are feeling slightly down and not 100%. But I feel like the mental side of it, you will feel better knowing that you've trained on your period and you've hit good numbers on your period, and it doesn't actually affect you as much as you might think that it does, or as much as people actually tell you that it does. For me personally, the first 2 days of my bleed are the worst. I feel my shittiest, it's a heavy bleed, I'm usually in quite a bit of pain. So this does affect my cycle, my training cycle. But my menstrual cycle is every 28 days and I come on pretty much to the hour, 5 o'clock on a Friday night. And one of my biggest sessions is a Saturday event session. So 1 in 4 of my event sessions, I am at my weakest, feeling my shittiest. But I have had so many PBs on these sessions and I can't base my training around feeling my shittiest, because then I'm missing 25% of my good event sessions. But also what I have found, which I've spoke about in some other videos, so I'm not going to go over it too much. I will link the other videos to this, which is PM8, which is a Team Affinity menstrual support product, and I've been taking this for, I think it's close to a year now, and it has had such a huge effect on my how I feel around my menstrual cycle. The low mood that I get beforehand has gone pretty much. Sometimes I get it now and again, but I think that's just, I'd probably get a low mood at that point anyway, because something's made me feel a little bit shitty. But my pain has substantially reduced. I still get pain, it's still sometimes hard to train, but I do find that once I get going with training, the pain kind of stops, and with the adrenaline and stuff, it comes back later on, but I get through the session pretty well. But taking PM8 has made an absolute huge difference to my training, and I do find that my menstrual cycle doesn't really affect me that much with it, especially whilst I'm taking PM8. But again, if I feel really bad the odd period, which sometimes I do, I'll just adjust my training around that one, but not tell my coach, oh, I'm due on my period on X date, can we have a lighter session, can we have a deload? Because I feel like you're just limiting your own progression with that. So I will link the Team Affinity PM8 links to the other videos that I've done. I'll probably start a YouTube, put this all on so that it's easily found, because I got a lot of really great feedback from that. If anyone has questions about PM8, I will do another video on it. But yeah, that's pretty much summing everything up. Again, it's everyone's own decision. I just wanted to give a little bit of information about how it actually affects you, and that the scientific evidence of the studies is quite minimal, the effect that your period actually has. It is more, obviously, the side effects of it, but your general strength, because of hormones, isn't really changed that much at all. You might feel a bit shitty because of the hormonal changes that are going causing the low mood and the pain and stuff like that, but actual strength is not affected. It is more the mental side of it that people believe it is, so don't usually tend to push themselves as much, or just avoid training much at those times altogether.